Simply Good, Cooking with Rebecca. Today I'll be making a basic bread recipe. This recipe is from Artisan Bread in 5 minutes a day. It uses a slightly different method than you might be used to for making bread, but it's a little bit less labor intensive and makes it more available for everyday use. I love it as a side dish or as a bread bowl is my favorite way to eat it with a nice bowl of soup. First thing I'm going to do is get 3 cups of hot tap water. Okay, once you have your 3 cups of hot tap water, you're going to be adding 4.5 teaspoons of yeast and 4.5 teaspoons of salt to that. I like to buy my yeast in a 1-pound container. I find that I make this bread enough that it's very cost effective to buy it. It costs about the same for a pound as it does for 3 packets, and since this recipe uses 2 packets, it's a lot cheaper. A pound lasts me almost a year, so to keep that fresh, I just stick it in an airtight container and keep that in my freezer, and it stays fresh for a long time. So once you have your salt and your yeast in your warm water, I just like to give that a quick stir. Otherwise I find it just kind of clumps up. Okay, so we set that aside, and we're going to get our flour. I make this recipe in a food processor. I find it's much easier. The cleanup is maybe a little harder than making it in a bowl, but I find that it's less labor intensive during the mixing, and I'd rather clean up than stir in all the flour. So it's 6.5 cups of flour into the food processor. Okay, so I have my 6.5 cups of flour. It's just regular all-purpose flour. You don't need bread flour for this. Then I'm going to put my lid on, and I'm just going to add my water with the food processor running. And you want to mix it just until your dough comes together. It'll be a very sticky dough. It's not going to look like a bread dough. It'll be very sticky. Okay, the dough looks good. It's all mixed. Don't worry too much about the consistency. I've had a wide range of consistencies and they've all worked. If it's real soupy, you may want to add a little bit of extra flour, but a little bit soupy is fine. And you can see that that's, it's not formed like a regular bread dough. You're going to put this in a container. You don't need to oil the container or anything. Just stick it in and let that sit out for about 2 hours until it's risen a little bit. And then you're just going to stick it in the refrigerator overnight. Okay, so once your bread is in your bowl, you're just going to set this on a counter or something to rise for about 2 hours until it's just about doubled. And then stick it in the fridge overnight. Okay, so I made this dough yesterday and have just pulled it out of the fridge. This is my bread container. I often have this in my fridge with dough. This recipe makes about 4 loaves of bread, and it keeps for 2 weeks, so I often just have this on hand, and when I decide I want bread with dinner, I pull out a loaf and make it. I bought this storage container. It fits nice. It's easy to put in my fridge. I don't often have a room for a large bowl in my fridge. This is nice and tall. It stands up. Works great. If you're going to get a container for your bread, it needs to be about 5 quarts. Then I just scoop out about 1/4 of the dough. I'm going to put that on some flour. Okay, so I've scooped my bread into this little bowl with flour. You can just put it on a floured countertop. I found that I was making this enough that I was constantly wasting flour and dirtying my countertops. So I just keep a little bowl of flour with a lid, and I just stick it in here. It keeps everything contained. It's much quicker cleanup. So you just sprinkle flour on top of the dough because it's still very wet. Once you've kind of floured your bread a little bit so it's not sticking to your hands, you're going to do what's called forming a gluten coat. You're going to just take your bread, fold it over itself, and make a nice smooth surface, and tuck it under. Then I'm going to set that back down in my flour and put cornmeal on my pan. You can use flour if you want. I like to use cornmeal. I like the texture on the bottom of the bread. You can use quite a bit of cornmeal just to make sure your bread doesn't stick, because when it sticks, it's really hard to get off the pan. So then we're just going to take our cloaked bread, set that on our cornmeal, and then flour a small knife a little bit, and then you're just going to cut some slashes. If you don't do this, your bread will, when it rises in the oven, it'll make kind of a mushroom loaf, and it'll look kind of funny. This way it'll split and you'll have a very nice artisan looking loaf. You're going to let this rise for 40 minutes. About 20 minutes into that rising period, you're going to preheat your oven to 450 degrees so that it's heated when you put your bread in. Bread is out of the oven, and that completes our basic bread recipe from Artisan Bread in 5 minutes a day. As we saw last week, it makes the perfect bread bowl for chili or just your favorite soup. It's one of my favorite ways to serve it. It's also really delicious, just sliced warm with butter. Melted butter on bread is always good. It only takes 4 ingredients, and it's simply good.